Welcome to Explosive Enterprises, and today we bring you the most hotly anticipated airsoft gun of 2023, the Tokyo Marui Saiga-12K gas blowback shotgun.
Got him. Yeah. Got him. Sorry, mate. You good? Hey!
It's been nearly 2 years since this gun was announced, and we've waited patiently for its release. Now that we get to see the final product, I'm actually not surprised it took so long to go from prototype to production, because there's a lot going on with this replica. So to start with, the Saiga... You know what, let's back up a second. A Saiga is an endangered species of antelope native to the Eurasian steppe, and it's the namesake for a Russian family of commercial sporting weapons based on the AK-100 series. This brand was developed by Izhevsky Machinostrelny Zavod, also known as Izhmash, which today is part of Kalashnikov concern. The Saiga-12 is ostensibly just a Saiga rifle rechambered for 12-gauge shotgun shells, but the very different characteristics of shotgun ammunition required substantial alterations to the gas system in action, and it's more accurate to describe this as an AK derivative. While it's had no formal adoption by any military or law enforcement agency, there have been sporadic small purchases by a number of Russian institutions, some European and Asian agencies, and, oddly, the US Coast Guard. Because the Saiga-12 is first and foremost a commercial product, there are many variants both to offer different features to prospective buyers and to comply with import restrictions in target markets. The variant Tokyo Marui chose to replicate is the Saiga-12K. This gun has a 17-inch barrel, hence the K for Korotkaya, or short, as compared to the 23-inch base model. And unlike the models more typically used by government agencies, it has a one-piece sporter-style handguard with no top heat shield, and this one even has a sight rib. Put simply, this is a gun intended as a civilian sporting shotgun for the domestic Russian market and for export to Europe. It wasn't intended to be a combat shotgun, and while photos can be found of Russian law enforcement personnel with this configuration, that likely has more to do with the haphazard and off-the-shelf nature of Russian small arms procurement rather than widespread use. The 12K variant has shown up frequently in video games though, probably due to the vent rib and handguard helping to visually distinguish it from rifle-caliber AKs. And given Tokyo Marui's established history producing guns for weebs, our money's on the inspiration being Metal Gear Solid 4. That's pure speculation on our part, which means it's definitely true.
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
Back to the replica, we'll start with externals. From muzzle to butt, this gun is almost entirely cast zinc aluminum alloy, as is typical for Tokyo Marui and verified by density analysis. So it's pot metal, but it's relatively nice pot metal, and not the brittle Zamac we sometimes see. There are only a couple of steel, aluminum, or brass parts, which I'll specifically point out, so if not mentioned, it's either pot metal or plastic. Most of the metal parts are painted, and the paint actually does a pretty good job of replicating the Voron finish developed by Izhmash for their AKs. The plastic is unremarkable, but it doesn't stand out or detract from the overall appearance. For specifics, let's start at the muzzle and go back. The stock muzzle device is a simple thread protector which goes over 23x1 right-handed threading. This is not the same as real Saiga muzzle devices, which are tantalizingly close at 22x0.75. The barrel is a simple tube, only partly exposed before it disappears under the handguard. The handguard is plastic, and as mentioned before, this is a copy of one of the sporter-style Saiga handguards. It's not the same as the ones on the rifle-caliber Saigas, and of course it's very different from military AK handguards, so it gives a little bit of a unique look to the gun. The handguard has this nice check ring on either side and finger grooves along the top, and is long enough to accommodate a more extended modern grip. I actually really like this handguard. It's grippy and ergonomic, has no wobble or play, and only minimal flex when squeezed. But as is typical for Marui, it is ABS, so it's much more susceptible to solvents than real steel, nylon, or fiberglass furniture. The handguard is secured in place by the front sling swivel, and note that while the swivel itself is steel, the lug which holds it is not. Moving up, we have the 2-position adjustable gas regulator, which rotates by depressing a small detent. You might assume that this would have no function on an airsoft gun, and you'd be correct, it's purely decorative. Above the gas regulator is the front bead sight, which is the only piece of brass on the gun. This is mounted to the sight rib, which is a standard grooved shotgun rib that runs only the short distance to the rear sight. There's an elevation knob that adjusts the height of the bead, and Marui includes a tool to relieve the spring tension holding it in place, but a small hex key will work fine too. The rear sight itself is 2 widely spaced wings that hold the rib with a cross pin, and it's just wide enough for the back end of the rib to have a bit of play, though this doesn't impact the windage at all since the sights themselves are fixed. The windage is adjustable, but it will require a bit of disassembly, which we'll cover later. The gas tube reaches back to the receiver, and here we have the only major steel component to the gun, which is the dust cover. Out of the box this was pretty loose, but bending up the front edge was enough to take up the slack. You'll notice it has the exact same painted finish as the rest of the gun, so there's no visual distinction between the steel and alloy parts. Going down the receiver, at the front is a cross pin which secures the front trunnion, and as with other pins on the gun, this is actually steel. Below it is the stock retaining latch, which holds the stock in place when folded. Above it is the Saiga-12K marking, which we sometimes see rendered as Kanta 12 by Americans who are allergic to Cyrillic. Above that is the serial number, which, as with all the other markings, is identical on all of the TM Saigas. The first 2 numbers, 03, indicate that this is copied off a gun manufactured in 2003. That doesn't quite match the 04 on the Izhmash proof stamp, but that's not too unusual. You make a gun in December 03, it gets proofed in January 04, now you have a gun with 2 consecutive years in the markings. The Cyrillic RST to the left is a conformity mark similar to the CE often seen on Western goods, but the 03 here actually isn't a year. The MJ03 code identifies the certifying agency, which in this case appears to be the Udmurt Certification Center in Izhevsk. Then there's the Izhmash logo, but this is a little off. The real logo is an arrow in stylized IJ and MASH in Cyrillic, Izhmash, but this one reads M-A-R-U-E.
What's I spell?
Very clever, Marui. On the right side is the caliber marking, 12x76mm, which means 12 gauge and up to 3-inch shells, and the nominal bore diameter of 18.3mm. Oddly, the bolt also carries the same digits of 183, but on a factory gun this should instead correspond to the last 3 digits of the serial number, which are 823. The selector markings are S for safe and F for fire. Again, this Saiga is based on a commercial gun intended for export, so the selector is marked in Latin characters rather than Cyrillic. And lastly, the overt Tokyo Marui markings are underneath the selector. All these markings are cast directly into the receiver, not actually engraved. The bolt carrier is fairly unremarkable for an AK, although the finish is slightly different from the rest of the externals, having a bit of a brown hue. That's a bit odd, as normally Russian AK bolt carriers are finished with the same paint as the rest of the gun, and while it's possible the carrier was deliberately cast from a different alloy, it's also possible it was just finished in a different batch. And behind the carrier is the dust cover flap, which both prevents debris from getting behind the carrier, and conceals that this bolt carrier is actually a bit longer than a real one. On the TM, the carrier ends just behind this cutout on the receiver, whereas on a real Saiga, the carrier ends just behind the wear line from the selector. As mentioned before, the selector is steel, but doesn't look any different from the rest of the gun. It travels smoothly down to the fire position and back up to safe. We added this middle divot, don't worry about it, we'll come back to that. The magazine release is a standard AK rocker type, and the trigger guard is steel. Note that unlike on a conventional AK, the Saiga-12 has a gap between them, and the mag release doesn't protrude below the trigger guard at all. Next to the trigger, which is unremarkable, is a small spring-loaded button. On the real Saiga-12, this is a manual bolt hold open mechanism, and pushing the button in while the bolt is back will lock it open. On the TM, it does nothing. It's just decoration. The pistol grip is ABS like the handguard, and is a good replica of a Soviet AK grip. Out of the box, it's completely matte, but with use it has smoothed out and become glossy at contact points. On the left side, it's marked 33/2, and while the slash in the middle identifies it as an Izhmash grip, we can't find enough information in open source reporting to confirm whether the mold designation of 33/2 is era appropriate for an early 2000s gun. And if you're used to AEG AK grips, just note that this is substantially thinner. Above the trigger on the left side is the accessory rail, which, like the bolt carrier, doesn't quite match the receiver despite also being alloy. This is real spec and accepts Russian AK dovetail mount optics with no modification. Below it are the trigger and hammer pins, and again, despite the different color, they are also alloy. And then we have the stock, which is also ABS, with a few metal parts. It has a steel sling swivel in an alloy mount, a cleaning kit or Skittles compartment in the butt, and a cutout to lock onto the retention claw. This button above the pistol grip unlocks the stock, and then it swivels forwards to lock up, where it can be released again by pushing in the button on the stock and swinging back out. Finally, we want to point out that all across the gun there are button head screws standing in for the rivets used on real AKs, and if you know what you're looking for, those hex heads stand out like a sore thumb. Any wear to the paint finish also stands out, as it has the characteristic white shine of zinc aluminum alloy. Now let's check out the magazine. This is a replica of the Izhmash 5-round magazines for the Saiga-12, and it's bigger than it might seem in photos, being comparable to a 30-round AR mag in both overall bulk and weight at 394 grams empty. As far as externals, once again the shell is ABS. That includes the feed lip plates, which on the real magazines are steel inserts. On the right side we again see the Izhmash-styled Marui mark with the unambiguous Tokyo Marui markings on the underside. While it would be very easy to write off the externals as just the usual Airsoft pot metal extravaganza, I think that would be a little unfair. While it is mostly alloy, it's metal in all the places it should be, and since the real guns are painted too, this replica does a good job of hiding its materials. If you look closely, you'll notice the screws and toy markings, and I do wish the furniture was nylon, but the ABS doesn't creak, wobble, or flex anywhere. Overall, I give it a 3.6 out of 5. Not great, not terrible. On to field stripping. First, we set the gun to fire and charge it to cock the action. Pressing in the spring guide frees the dust cover. The guide goes forwards to free it, and takes the recoil spring assembly with it, and once it's out I can pull out the bolt carrier, and that's the gun field stripped. The two major areas of complete disassembly are the trigger group and the barrel group. These are totally separate from one another and can be approached in either order, but we'll start with the trigger group. First, I tap out the hammer and trigger pins from right to left. Now to get the selector out, it's necessary to decock the action, so I press the auto sear to release it, then pull the trigger while easing the hammer forwards. Now I push down on the disconnector and hold it back while rotating the selector to the vertical position, which allows the selector to wiggle out the side. At this point the trigger box is free, and a bit of wiggling and prying gets it out. Be very careful with this, and we suggest having the left side upwards, as there are exposed parts and springs on the left side that may fall out. For the barrel group, I first take out a screw on the underside of the receiver, and this frees the retaining latch for the stock, clearing one of the two left side trunnion screws. I take out these two screws, then the corresponding two on the other side, and then knock the trunnion pin out from right to left. This time we recommend having the right side upwards because the barrel group contains a split ring and spring-loaded ball bearing that will also try to fall out. On the barrel, I can now simply pull the hop assembly out, and on the trunnion, I can carefully push out what I'm going to call the triple nozzle, taking care not to lose the ball bearings and or springs that again will fall out. Let me tell you, if you take this apart on a shag carpet, it's all over. That's it for accessing all the mechanical functions, but if we, say, want to swap the furniture, there's a little more to do. On the barrel group, the handguard is secured via the sling swivel. Taking this out allows the handguard to slide forwards and then pivot off. The pistol grip simply unscrews. Note that both of these can be done on a fully assembled gun. For the stock, we can knock out the swivel pin with the gun assembled, though note that the dust cover has to be removed, but the rear trunnion can only come out if the trigger box is removed. Also, while I'm not going to do it because it isn't necessary and realignment is kind of a pain, removing the barrel group just requires removing two grub screws, driving two cross pins out from right to left, and removing the rib screw. The gas block then slides forwards, and the barrel itself can unscrew. Anyways, let's go piece by piece. The barrel group takes down with two more screws, and the inner barrels and buckings appear to be the same design as those of Tokyo Marui spring shotguns. These are a lot shorter than the outer barrel, so cutting down the outer is viable. I also want to point out that these barrels come slightly twisted in the outer barrel by default, and we verify that this is consistent across multiple guns, as this deliberate misalignment slightly increases the spread in a consistent triangular pattern. And to be clear, there's no mechanism to adjust the hop, it's fixed, so what you get is what you get. In the chamber, a spring-loaded ramp prevents BBs from spilling into the barrels prematurely and is pushed out of the way by the triple nozzle to load. The triple nozzle incorporates a spring-loaded stopper, which gets pushed back by any BBs in the chamber to force this lever down. I'm going to briefly switch over to the magazine because this is really cool. Even if the magazine is loaded with BBs, this blocker bar sits in front of the valve and will prevent the valve knocker from striking it. But if this lever on the top is pushed down, it allows the bar to drop and then the gun will fire. The lever on the mag in turn gets pushed down by that lever on the triple nozzle if there's at least one BB in the chamber. So basically, unlike most gas blowback guns where you can cock the action, insert a mag, and then it'll dry fire, the Saiga will only fire if there are actually BBs in the chamber or if the magazine is set to dry fire mode. Otherwise, it just goes click. We'll come back to the magazine. The next bit of cleverness has to do with the ball bearings that made a daring bid for freedom when I removed the triple nozzle. These go on either side of the triple nozzle, and when it's fully back, the ball bearings can pop into recesses in the receiver, which locks the triple nozzle in place and allows BBs to feed. As the triple nozzle is pushed forwards, the ball bearings get pushed in and are able to pop out again in the forward position, locking the triple nozzle forwards. Inside the triple nozzle, springs under the ball bearings also act on a pair of conical hooks. These hooks grab onto what I'll call the main nozzle, and this brings us to the heart of how exactly Marui engineered a gas blowback tri-shot. Basically, this is a fairly standard gas blowback nozzle and carrier assembly, except obviously the main nozzle is huge and there is no arm for feeding from a magazine. Instead, it has an external O-ring, plus a small flat indent on either side, and this is what interacts with those hooks. As the main nozzle comes forwards, it plugs into the triple nozzle, sealing on the O-ring and locked in by the hooks, and then continues to push forwards. And when the gun is ready to fire, the ball bearings, as mentioned, settle into another pair of grooves to lock the triple nozzle in place. When the gun is fired, the hooks help hold the nozzle forwards until the carrier has traveled far enough to pull the nozzle back, and then a pair of springs on the barrel group push the triple nozzle back too. When the carrier comes forwards, the process repeats. Note that these springs look a little funny because I unnecessarily messed with them while trying to diagnose a minor issue. Don't worry about it, this is not from normal wear and tear, it's just because a caveman owns this gun. Last thing on the barrel group is the windage adjustment, which on real Saigas is accomplished by simply tapping the rear sight dovetail to either side with a punch, but here it's a little more involved. First, the cross pin taps out from right to left, and that frees the rib, though take care not to lose the tiny little split ring that holds the pin in place. With the pin out of the way, we can see a screw tensioning against the front trunnion, and with this loosened, then the rear sight can be pushed from side to side, and then tightened again to secure it. Moving back to the carrier, you might wonder what controls the release of gas. Behold, the biggest rocket valve I've ever seen. Let's take this apart further. Just one screw on the underside of the carrier, and the nozzle and return spring come out. And then I just pull one pin out of the nozzle, and look at that, the rocket valve dumps out. Adjusting this rocket valve to increase or decrease power should be trivial, but there are other implications to changing the power that we'll cover later. Also notice that this system uses a stationary piston head that seals inside the nozzle, which nowadays is still common on pistols but rarely seen on rifles. We notice that even with the apertures plugged, this nozzle doesn't develop a good seal, but that's certainly in part due to the use of a ported piston head which should expand under pressure. It's difficult to assess whether it is actually sealing optimally in operation, but performance is good enough that we're not concerned. When reassembling, the spring guide rod needs to be inserted into the nozzle before reinserting into the carrier, and the screw must be tightened enough to prevent wobble of the piston. The entire bulk carrier weighs 315 grams, comparable to the total reciprocating mass of a GHK or VFC AR, and includes the mock gas piston, which is aluminum, not zinc alloy, and left unpainted. The carrier is a bit longer than a real one to accommodate the nozzle, as is typical for gas blowback AKs, and the buffer system limits its travel, so the overall stroke length is 3.3 inches, or about 2/3 that of the real thing. As we've said before on this channel, short stroking has zero effect on efficiency despite the prevailing myth, but this does increase cyclic rate and felt recoil. When cycling, the bolt works against a 3-stage spring system. There is a soft recoil spring up front, separated from a stiffer one by the dust cover flap. So as the bolt starts to cycle, it only fights against the weak front spring until it recocks the hammer and retracts the nozzle, and then after that the stronger spring starts to compress to soak up remaining kinetic energy. Then the guide rod houses a third very stiff spring buffer that takes up whatever energy still remains in the carrier at the end of travel and kicks the carrier back forwards. Overall, this combination of springs is geared towards maximizing efficiency and recoil and allowing the gun to fully cycle even with low input pressure, all while keeping an acceptable cyclic rate. But even with that stiff spring buffer, after only about 100 cycles, we started to notice peening to the back of the bulk carrier, indicating that it's managing to compress the buffer far enough to strike the housing. We're a little surprised that Marui went with just a bare spring here, considering their AKM has a more sophisticated recoil buffer that better distributes the force. So while Aftermarket may produce a more elegant solution, in the interim we've inserted a small section of 5/8 inch outer diameter rubber tubing that resists compression and prevents the bolt from bottoming out against the metal, and the wear has not progressed any further. After about 1,000 cycles, we are also seeing substantial peening to the bolt carrier where it impacts the hammer during recoil. Fortunately, this isn't a critical surface since the hammer will still get reset as long as some part of the bolt shoves it down, but it's something to keep an eye on. Next up is the fire control group, and to better show how it works, I'm going to switch to a brand new pack with the selector installed. So looking inside the trigger box, we can see a hammer, trigger, and disconnector, and these look very similar to their real AK equivalents. When the trigger is pulled, it drops off the front of the hammer, releasing it, and also cams the disconnector forwards to grab the hammer as it resets. The trigger must then be released again to reset, and it will not fire unless the in-battery safety, also known as an auto-sear, is tripped. The hammer coming forwards pushes the valve knocker forwards, as is tradition, and it locks in place until the valve knocker lock is tripped by the carrier as it cycles. All pretty standard, but there are a couple things to note. First, we observe that the way this trigger pack functions is an interesting mix of real and airsoft. The parts of the fire control group and how they interact are all taken directly from their real counterparts, but instead of using torsion springs, the trigger box design allows the use of compression springs, which while less realistic allows the system to work with much softer springs than its real counterpart. Even the selector mechanism, which on the real thing just relies on the tension of the selector against notches in the receiver to hold position, has a secondary detent system to keep it in position. The overall impression is a fire control system that looks and feels realistic at first glance, but under the hood it deviates significantly from the real design to work properly with weak springs and cast parts, and so we expect these parts to last a long time. Second, if the gun is set to safe, the trigger is prevented from moving, and this will prevent the gun from cocking the hammer, so it's necessary to switch to fire before charging the gun. And third, there's a, let's say, hidden feature. By default, the trigger cannot move unless the selector is all the way in the semi-auto position, and that's because of a small nub on the selector axle that blocks the trigger. I'm just going to grind off this nub. The trigger can now move when the selector is between safe and semi, which allows it to fire. But in this position, the selector is blocking the disconnector, so the disconnector does not function, and the hammer will release every time the auto-sear is tripped. That's right, this is now capable of full auto without impacting the safety or semi-auto positions. To keep the selector in position, I'll also file a shallow notch in the selector detent system, and then drill a small divot on the receiver for the selector nub to lock into. The grip secures with a single long screw, just like a real AK, which passes through a nut that simply drops into the receiver. Unlike the real grip, it has some internal support structure, but a real grip will fit with minimal or no modification. While there isn't much to talk about as far as parts in the stock, the tiny screw which secures the stock release button has shown a tendency to start unscrewing under recoil and should definitely be thread locked. This button is what releases the stock when folded, and while it looks like it might be uncomfortable to shoulder with it sticking out, the spring is so soft that it just collapses against the shoulder and we don't notice it at all. Let's look at the magazine in more detail now. First things first, be aware that if you have to remove the magazine shell, this will be a complex and time-consuming process. I lied. Fundamentally, this is a plastic midcap on the front grafted to a gas reservoir and output system on the back. The gas portion uses a standard Tokyo Marui two-way valve and has a conventional output valve and gas router, but it also features a temperature-sensitive tape that lights up to show how warm the gas reservoir currently is. With this tape, plus the ability to remove the reservoir from its insulating shell, it's pretty easy to warm the mags back up and know when they've fully recovered from cooldown. The reservoir is full at 11 grams of gas, at which point the two-way valve starts spitting liquid gas back out. On the front, the plastic midcap has a simple U-shaped track which holds exactly 45 BBs. That provides 15 shots, which is 3 times the capacity of its real counterpart, but, amusingly, the same total number of projectiles as 5 rounds of double-aught 1 1/8 ounce buckshot. The follower can protrude from the magazine, which ensures that the gun actually does feed and fire all 45 BBs, but it will drop 2 BBs if a still-loaded magazine is removed from the gun. Like on an AEG mag, the BBs are released by pulling on a small catch, which is engaged by a protrusion inside the gun. And as mentioned before, there is a spring-loaded lever on the side which constitutes the stop-on-empty mechanism. If there are no BBs in the chamber, a bar lifts into place to block the valve, and then the gun will simply go click. I mentioned before that we had messed with the tri-nozzle return springs to correct an issue, and that issue was 1 magazine out of 10 failing to reliably load 3 BBs and instead often doing 2. The actual fix turned out to be pretty easy. Removing a single screw on the side of the BB track allows the spring, guide, and follower components to extract. We gave the feed spring a very gentle stretch, and then reassembled, and the problem disappeared entirely. We're not sure whether the spring was weak, if possibly part of the system had been assembled incorrectly and was causing excess drag inside the feed track, or if it was just a break-in issue on the gun itself, but either way, this issue has not recurred since. The feed section on the magazine can be separated from the gas section by removing just 2 screws. While the mid-cap portion is clamshell plastic, the gas portion is an aluminum reservoir made into a pot metal body. I'll open up the reservoir, and this reveals a tube around the fill valve that prevents overfilling. Notice just how long this is. By default, the magazine never fills beyond about 1/3 full of liquid propellant. While it is possible to cut the tube short and get substantially more gas into the magazine, with the high throughput of the system, this dramatically increases the risk of siphoning liquid and, as we'll see later, really isn't necessary. Going further, if I remove the screw securing the blocking lever, I can access the valve. The valve itself is unremarkable, except it's adjustable. If I insert a spacer while retightening it, I can align the drum to partially close off the valve, limiting how much gas is actually released. This doesn't have any discernible impact on recoil or efficiency, probably because the gun is massively overgassed on propane to begin with, but does make a difference to muzzle velocity. Once the valve is tight, the drum stays in position. Oh, and there is also a dry fire mode accessible via a small switch. So the only design issue we've noticed with this magazine is that the feed lips do protrude out substantially, so if the magazine is inserted incorrectly, it's possible to catch the feed lips on the protrusion that engages the BB release. If this is done violently enough, it could break the feed lips, which has happened to more than one user so far. We'll cover how to avoid this later. The 2-way fill valve makes this very easy to gas up. Insert the propane canister, ignore the hissing, fill until liquid starts spewing out, and then stop. This ensures a perfect fill every time without having to worry about underfilling or overfilling. Then the magazine can be loaded with BBs using a normal AEG speed loader, just like a mid-cap. So yeah, that's the Saiga. The combination of a tri-shot style feed system with an otherwise conventional gas blowback system is pretty straightforward, but there's a lot of additional complexity in the details. The key difference between this and Marui's 870s or KSG, though, is that everything on the Saiga is easily accessible without having to disassemble a bunch of tiny, fragile parts. Need to access the trigger box? 2 pins, remove the selector. Barrel assembly? 5 screws, 1 pin. Nozzle? 1 screw. You got dirt in the feed track? Literally 1 screw. So while there's a lot going on under the hood, it's all easy to access and doesn't involve any tiny screws until you get down to the individual parts. And while none of the internals are steel, Marui is experienced at designing around the limitations of their materials, and so aside from that peening of the bulk carrier, we don't see any noticeable wear. Overall, I'm really impressed. On to operation, and magazine insertion deserves some attention. On a real AK, the magazine can enter the magwell with just a shallow angle and then rock back to lock, but if you try that here, the feed lips hit the internals and it doesn't work. Instead, it's necessary to insert the mag at a more exaggerated angle, hook it onto the front shelf, and then rock it back. Getting it to actually lock in place also requires a concerning amount of force on new mags, but we've observed that the mags do break in with use, or the process can be accelerated by filing the front lug inwards and upwards. Once a mag is inserted, the rest is straightforward. The magazine release is a simple thumb lever, and the gap between it and the trigger guard makes it easy to actuate with a thumb. The selector is standard AK stuff, push all the way down for semi-auto and all the way up for safe, and if the fire control group has been modified to allow full auto, then that position is right in the middle. Unlike on a real AK, there isn't a lot of tension behind this selector, so it's not hard to engage and disengage with an index finger instead of the thumb as designed. The gun must be taken off safe to charge it, then pull the charging handle to load. Because the recoil springs are fairly weak, the bolt return is sluggish, and in fact, after about 1,000 cycles, the recoil springs have set enough that it may actually fail to return to battery when held vertically, though it will still cycle fine in this orientation if actually fired. The trigger pull is fairly light, but it's a long, creepy, mushy pull that actually slackens right before it releases as the trigger starts to slip off the hammer, and then has another 1/4 inch of over travel after that, but at least it has a tactile reset. Real AKs also have sloppy triggers, but this is really bad, and even without replacing the parts, a bit of reshaping and polishing for a cleaner break would go a long ways. But this isn't a gun where the trigger pull will make or break it, it's a shotgun, so let's actually shotgun. First off, that is loud. Like the VFC FAL, it occasionally sets my ear ringing indoors, so hearing protection is a good idea. And for an airsoft gun, the sensation of recoil is pretty great. The carrier comes slamming back on each shot with none of the sluggishness of, say, GHK AKs, and with a significantly longer travel distance too. TM has done a great job of making this feel more substantial than a normal gas blowback rifle, and it's the polar opposite of the anemic puff of the 870 or KSG. In terms of efficiency, at 70 Fahrenheit and on propane, the gun is capable of doing about 50 shots in continuous semi-auto before it fails to fully cycle, but even with 5 minutes between strings of 15, it only managed about 10 more in total. On a magazine chilled to freezing, it was still able to clear a full mag, though without much gas to spare. So the bottom line is that you don't need to worry about getting through a mag, and in warm weather, it can be reloaded with BBs at least once or twice without needing to regas. And since it has usable efficiency, you can even do this. Yeah, that's a lot of DACA. Now it's time to chrono, and here we have a complication. Most chronos struggle with multiple BBs at once and give bogus readings, but we can't just load one BB at a time because the gas will evacuate through the empty barrels and produce a low reading. Instead, we have to orient the gun such that only one BB actually passes through the chrono, and with the top barrel crudely isolated in this manner, we can occasionally get a clean read. At 70 Fahrenheit and with .32 gram BBs and the magazine valve fully open, we get about 1.1 joules. With the valve half closed, we get about 0.85 joules, and with it mostly closed, we get about 0.7 joules. This allows for some range of adjustment to account for weather and field limits, just remember it needs to be done on every mag. Now you might be wondering, why use 32s for a tri-shot? Here's why. On propane and tuned to 1 joule, the fixed hop-up lifts .32s nicely, but anything lighter heads for the moon beyond 100 feet. Reducing the power does allow it to work with lighter BBs, but realistically, .3s are probably the minimum weight for this gun on propane, and at maximum power, .36s will give a fairly flat trajectory out to typical AEG ranges. As mentioned previously, if the gun only loads 1 or 2 BBs, it will shoot much more weakly, so let's demonstrate. First the full 3, then 2 BBs, and now 1. Well, that brings us to practicality. First off, in stock form, the gun is bigger than it might seem, with an overall length of just under 36 inches. This is comparable to a 16-inch AR carbine, and while this is fine in CQB if you know what you're doing, we suspect many users are going to chop it to just ahead of the inner barrels. The gun weighs 3.15 kilograms, or just under 7 pounds loaded, and since the center of balance is over the back of the magazine, it handles quite nicely. The AK stock is short by modern standards and the pistol grip near vertical, so it's easy to tuck in close to the body when shooting squared, and the long handguard allows a thumb over bore support grip if you so desire. However, note that the cheek cutout in the stock favors a more bladed, forward-leaning stance to get a good sight picture, as is common practice in former Warsaw Pact states. I mentioned before that the pistol grip is very thin, and I also find that if I choke up on the grip with bare hands, the sharp corner of the rear trunnion digs into my thumb, so gloves are a good idea with the stock grip. The sights are okay, I guess. The rib is way too short to be of any use as an aiming aid, and it's no surprise that this was ditched on later Saiga-12Ks, but the brass front bead is easy to pick up and situate between the wide rear sight blades. This is not very precise, but it is usable, and because the sights are a little higher than standard AK sights, I find I'm able to get a proper sight picture even while wearing Mesh Face Pro. Still, a red dot is a straight upgrade. The real hurdle to overcome is working with the magazines. First, the mags are enormous and won't fit in most rifle mag pouches. I can just squeeze them into these HSGI tacos, but there's no way I'm re-indexing mid-game, so 308 or 12-gauge pouches may be necessary, although generic 308 or Alice mag pouches seem to hold them just fine. Anyways, while the release valve is recessed, the feed lips are exposed and fairly fragile. There are gas magazines you can be rough with, but this isn't one of them. Inserting the magazine into the gun then takes some finesse. As mentioned before, they need an exaggerated angle to hook in properly, but then also a lot of force to seat unless filed or broken in. It is possible to insert a mag, start to rock it back, hear the click, and then drop the mag, because that was the sound of the follower being released, not the magazine catch engaging. The best way we found to load reliably is to insert the mag at roughly a 45-degree angle, pull forwards until it catches on the front, and then rock back sharply. Charge it and you're good to go, and with just a bit of practice we've had no issues reloading in-game. As mentioned before, the gun will not fire on an empty chamber, but it also doesn't have any indication that the gun is empty until you pull the trigger and it goes click. So suppose you go to execute a tactical reload and notice that the magazine you just removed is empty. The question is, are there actually BBs in the chamber, or did you just completely run out of ammo?
I know what you're thinking. Did he fire
15
shots or only
14?
Strictly speaking, there is a way to chamber check by pushing on the lever that sticks out the bottom of the tri-nozzle. If it can move, the chambers are empty. If it can't move, it's loaded. But since this is difficult to do in the field, the more judicious option might be to point the muzzle at the ground and rack the charging handle. If it was loaded, the extra BBs just fall out. If the magazine isn't empty when you remove it, it will drop 2 BBs in a similar manner to an AEG magazine, so there's no convenient way to check whether you still have ammo short of firing. And at extreme orientations, these can sometimes get caught in the internals and prevent a new mag from inserting. Magazine quirks aside, if you need to reload mags in the field, this is about as easy as it gets. The BB track reloads just like a mid-cap, and the two-way fill valve makes filling quick and reliable. Once all the logistics are sorted though, this gun performs fantastically. Despite the poor trigger, I find it easy to get quick double taps off when necessary, but with decent aim it often only takes one shot to score a hit, so having just 15 shots per mag is actually pretty manageable. With appropriate BB weight, they fly flat quite a distance, so it isn't necessary to account for drop like with other gas tri-shots, and a red dot feels like easy mode, though it is necessary to aim to be at all effective. We really want to stress that with the tight spread, it's less like a video game shotgun and more like a gas rifle that happens to spit 3 BBs at a time instead of 1. That is a huge advantage in the peekaboo exchanges that are a staple of Airsoft, and while it is only about 1 joule per BB, that makes way less of a difference than Airsofters tend to think. Since this is a brand new gun, obviously there isn't any official aftermarket yet, but some real parts will fit. The handguard can be replaced with real steel Saiga handguards or rail systems, but may require some modification as the Marui barrel is 23.5mm in diameter rather than 22.5 like the real thing. The default muzzle threads are M23x1 right-handed as mentioned before, so Airsoft accessories with that threading will fit. It's also easy to cut short with a hacksaw or pipe cutter, but rethreading to a real steel M22x.75 is challenging due to the wider diameter, and our attempt with a die and handle made a mess. Either use an annular cutter to reduce the diameter first, or get someone with a lathe to do it. Real AK pistol grips are a drop-in fit though, and there are many options that are more ergonomic than the original Soviet grip. With the stock, it gets a little tricky. This is a folding rear trunnion, so only folding stocks will fit, but the pin that secures the stock is neither the older 4.5mm standard nor the newer 5.5mm one, it's an annoyingly intermediate 5.1mm or 13/64 inches. If you stick with the default stock, a GP25 recoil pad fits tightly and increases the length of pull to the more Western standard M16A1 length, although there is no slot on the stock for its strap. We were able to swap to a Sima side folder by boring out the hinge to 13/64 inches, adding a 5mm tall spacer to the pin, and doing just a bit of filing and shimming to get it to align properly. Additionally, we have the aforementioned GP25 recoil pad, and to help get a cheek weld with optics, a few wraps of electrical tape allows a reproduction SVD cheek rest to clamp to the stock. Lastly, a real Axion Cobra is a drop-in fit. Frankly, as with most Russian optics, this is a terrible sight with a narrow field of view partially obscured by its emitter housing, and this one even has a canted reticle, but it's still usable, and its recognizable appearance gives it some charm. Anyways, as far as additional parts we'd like to see, it would be a shame if Tokyo Marui passed up the opportunity to replicate the Ishmash 8-round Saiga magazines. I should note that real Saiga magazine shells may be modifiable to hold the Marui internals, though filing out the internal spacer ribs will be a pain, but the curvature of longer mag shells means fitting the short Marui internals to a longer shell will be difficult, so this might require a factory solution. Oh, and there are also about 13,000 HPA drum solutions on the way. For full disclosure, we find Saiga drums to be pretty awkward, and to be clear, they are an exclusively US civilian market invention, if that matters to your LARPing, but it should be a fairly straightforward build. Otherwise, we'd like to see if we can find hop-up buckings that apply less hop, just to provide more options for BB weight and power tuning. Some sort of rubber plug for the spring buffer might be nice to replace our interim solution of rubber tubing, and a slightly stronger recoil spring would be good as well. Beyond that, steel internals are always welcome, but don't appear necessary, and the fact that our wish list is so short and all nice-to-haves rather than major fixes should really tell you all you need to know about this gun. As usual, we'll sum up with a list of pros and cons. It's a pretty good looking replica that hides its mediocre materials with a decent painted finish, and is metal where it should be metal and plastic where it should be plastic. Internally, it's more the same cast alloy and plastic, but designed around the limitations of its materials such that there aren't any obvious weak points, and wear seems limited to non-critical dimensions. Despite being mechanically complex, it's compartmentalized in a way that makes it a breeze to work on, and it comes apart and goes back together with a minimum of fuss. But it doesn't need to be taken apart, because right out of the box this is a solid performer with great efficiency and unexpectedly good hop performance, and it's just plain fun to shoot once you learn how to properly handle the magazines. It can outshoot rifles, it works in warm weather, it works in cold weather, it's easy to refill in the field. It will need heavy BBs, and for use with propane it's probably a good idea to reinforce the buffer as we showed, but otherwise this gun is good to go out of the box. Finally, that brings us to price. We're seeing prices vary from $400 to $500 for the gun and $40 to $50 per magazine, but even at the upper end of that range, it's a bargain for what you get. While the materials aren't amazing, the design quality, shooting experience, and raw gameplay performance all make up for it in spades, on top of it being just such an interestingly novel design. We would not recommend this gun if you consider unrealistic internals or heavy use of pot metal to be deal breakers, or if your local fields won't allow the necessary heavy BBs for whatever reason. Otherwise, if you consider yourself a shotgun enthusiast, a Russian gun nerd, a gas blowback fanatic, or just a player looking for something atypical but effective, we think you'll love Tokyo Marui's rendition of the Saiga-12K. It's been a long time coming, but we're happy to say it's worth the wait, and we wholeheartedly recommend this product. That's all for today, so let us know in the comments if you have any questions, and as always, thank you for watching.